We are trying to make a tool, not just any tool. We are trying to make the tool. Now, what is a tool? A tool is something that lets you do something. What, therefore, would be the ultimate tool? It would let you do anything. And as William Burroughs says, anything. That's what it would let you do. The flying saucer comes into the discussion at this point. The flying saucer, I believe, is an image of this tool that haunts the human experience of historical concrescence. It haunts the psyche of human beings and the skies of Earth, because like the bar ball spinning in the club, it is a precursive reflection of the tool at the end of time. The people who got this right are the alchemists of the 15th and 16th century, who believed that out of matter you could coax a universal substance that would be a perfect panacea. It would be all things to all people. It would cure all diseases, confer immortality, change lead to gold. The blind would see, the halt would walk, the dead would rise. And this ideal was immediately in place before the birth of modern science as the goal of the exploration of matter. And I think that we are possibly looking at a technology which the newspapers will call time travel, but which the people who create it will explain, well, it's not that at all. You see, it's actually a reductive doubling of hyperspatial feedback in a heteroclinic situation. But it comes off as time travel. Because one way that I can imagine linear history ending is by it just simply ending. Linear history depends on the past staying what it is. If you have time travel, it's possible to imagine a cultural domain where the past is constantly being changed, in which case you can't describe the ebb and flow of novelty with a simple Cartesian graph. So it could be something like that. Or it could be something somewhat of a metaphysical type. I mean, here's the Stephen King version of what it could be. Imagine if on the day of concrescence the sun exploded. Well, now that would certainly put rainforest activism in a quandary. The explosion of the sun would kill all life instantly on the earth. We don't know what death is. Our secular materialists cheerfully assure us that it's a big nothing, but that's just their guess. Nobody knows. Nobody knows. But a mass die-off like that would instantaneously propel the entire biota of the planet into death, whatever that is. And that might be part of the dynamics of the solar system. I don't like that idea. It's rather morbid. But there are some problems with the sun. There are some curious disjunctures between measurement of solar radiation and nuclear theory that suggest that the sun may not be as healthy as we would like it to be. Yeah. Psychedelics catalyze the imagination, inform the population, and allow people to entertain larger perspectives than the completely pissant perspectives which they're being given by the popular media. I mean, the popular media exhibits no imagination at all. That's why we have no space program. That's why we have no advanced research project agency, no commitment to explore the solar system, and so forth and so on. It turns out that really was all being done to beat the Russians. All that fine talk about space flight and the outward urge, that was just Pentagonese horse shit so they could dig into our genes and build intercontinental ballistic missiles. We who believed that we were headed out into the starry universe were, as usual, shafted. Well, that's a little coda on that. I see it's time to knock off for a while. We have time for one more question, though. Is this working for people? I mean, I wander one way and then another.
Just to lead from what you just... Oh, sorry.
No, you...
What you just said about all this, the space program stuff. Why all the... There seems to be this incredible influx of sci-fi in the media, as far as like programming and television, films. What's your comment on that? I mean,
well, I think that virtual reality, the entertainment industry, I mean, if you look at the figures, if we spent as much money trying to save the planet as we are spending trying to develop advanced systems of electronic entertainment, hell, we'd fix it overnight. That would just be a done deal. I'm suspicious. I'm a techno fan, and I use technology, and I'm into it. But I was with Howard Rheingold one night, actually here at Esalen, when we achieved a kind of apotheosis together. And he said to me, he said, "My God, I've just realized what virtual reality is for." And I said, "What's it for, Howard?" And he said, "It's to keep us from ever leaving the planet." And I see in the game design and in the website design and in the look and feel of the net how it's to be a simulacrum of the great frontier. You know, it's going to all be virtual, the trip to Pluto and the conquest of Mars and the journey out to Andromeda. I think I don't fault technology. You just have to be very aware. But, it's like heroin. And we must not consume. We must produce. As a community, the psychedelic community must produce art, not consume it. If they get it flowing the other way and we begin to consume it, then we are depotentiated. So what I've said, the millennial program is to put the art pedal to the floor. In virtual reality, the difference between a 10-story building and a 100-story building is 1 0. Enter the 0, and it's now a 100-story building. We can build with light. The constraints of material and the constraints of capital investment that have limited us in three-dimensional space are not going to be present in VR. And I think we're going to be able to build those castles in the sky. And that what I've said this many times, as I see the late 20th century cultural enterprise, what we're trying to do here is turn the human body inside out. We want to take the mind, which is this invisible hyperspatial organ with its teeming imagination, and we want to make it literal or virtual. We want to bring it into existence. Meanwhile, the body has become, because there are so many bodies, a real drag on the political system. So the body wants to become something freely commanded in the imagination. And it's literally like we are turning ourselves inside out. And this is an alchemical process. So now I've spoken of the alchemical process as something happening to the body, as a cultural enterprise building a tool, as an irresistible motion toward an attractor, which can be glimpsed through the hyperdimensional vision conferred by psychedelics. And And then it merely remains to unpack and download these ideas into the popular and mass culture, because I think they assuage anxiety. People feel better about themselves and the fate and direction of the world. But, we have painted ourselves into a hell of a situation here. The momentum of our past mistakes is staggering. The good news is we primates love a good fight, and we don't really get our dander up until the last possible moment. This is it. This is the last possible moment. As old pilots like to say, I think we're turning final here. These weekends tear past with amazing rapidity. And I was lying in bed last night thinking of everything that was not said, and it seemed like hardly anything was said. I don't know what that means. In myself personally, I've noticed in the last year or so a sense that the vision or the thinking about our circumstance has become almost for me like a full-time job. I really don't want to go anywhere, and I don't want to do anything. I just want to hold the understanding in my mind. And I don't know exactly where this is leading. It's probably leading to writing more books and doing less traveling. In terms of launching various memes, I think they're pretty well launched. The idea that the psychedelic experience needs to be given a place in the social toolkit, the idea that we need to seriously revision our relationship to nature and the future. I think all these things have come a distance. Yeah.
I'm real curious about one thing. Why is it important for you to do this?
I wonder myself. You mean, am I the alien ambassador, whether I like it or not? Well, I often, when asked this question, I've said, it beats honest work. I mean, my brother is a PhD in 3 subjects and works in hard science, and I don't think it's brought him immense happiness, not that he's despondent. But I was always kind of a slider, and certainly when I reached La Chirera in 1971, I had a price on my head by the FBI. I was running out of money. I was at the end of my rope. And then they recruited me and said, with a mouth like yours, there's a place for you in our organization. And, I've worked in deep background positions about which the less said, the better. And then, about 15 years ago, they shifted me into public relations, and I've been there to the present. I think ideas get me high, and I like the feeling of understanding, and I love diversity to the point of weirdness. I mean,
There's more to it than that for you, because, being tuned into ideas and turned on by ideas is one thing, but you can keep it just to yourself. The sharing of it is something else. I think that's what I'm getting. How do you do that?
Well, one thing is, I'm really fascinated. I think of myself as a pretty savvy person and not easily led into false dogma. And yet, this is such a strange idea. And so it's basically a plea for help. It's not a cult. It's not that I want you to join me in believing in this. It's that this is so outlandish that join me as a scientist would join a research team, and let's cut it to pieces and show that it was simply a misunderstanding of information theory coupled with bad mathematics spliced onto a weak ontology or something like that, you know. Because this I could live with the time wave if I only had to read about it in Time magazine and that it was being developed by Negroponte and Prigozhin. The thing that sets up the cognitive dissonance for me is that I, from the point of view of most people, thought it up. And I am so aware of my limitations that to me that's the strongest argument there is that it's malarkey, you know. And yet that's not a fair argument against an idea. In rhetoric, that's called the ad hominem argument, the argument to the man. That's when you get up and say, well, we shouldn't follow Jesse Helms because he's short and ugly. You know, that's not allowed. That's a below-the-belt move. And then I read books like Thomas Kuhn's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions, and it says, you know, this is how it happens. Some guy, marginal, not at the center of the field, and somewhat at loose ends, but usually with a broad education, gets it, you know. I mean, it happened to Einstein. He was a telegrapher. It happened to Alfred Russel Wallace. He was a surveyor who couldn't make a living, and so he went to Indonesia to collect butterflies for the British Museum. And we could multiply these examples ad infinitum. So, but I have spent a lot of time educating myself about what it would mean if this were true. In other words, how big a revolution is it? And it's an enormous revolution. The implications are staggering. For example, if it's true that time is a fluctuating variable, as this so strongly argues, then science as practiced for the past 500 years is out the window, because that kind of science is based on the concept of experiment. And experiment has built into it the concept of what's called a restoration of initial conditions. That means you can go back to the start and run the experiment again. This is saying, as Heraclitus said, you never step into the same river twice. And consequently, the idea of repetitive experiment is shown to be intellectually bankrupt. You could almost say, pardon me?
Scientists have already have recognized that.
Well, some have and some haven't. The idea that you would specify in a physics experiment that it should be done only when the moon is in Scorpio to obtain the correct results would get you...
But those experiments are primarily Newtonian in orientation, are they not? I mean,
well, give me an example of a time-dependent physical experiment recognized by science.
I mean, you know, dropping a ball out of the Tower of Pisa.
Well, it doesn't matter what time you do it. That's my point. That's my point. That we could almost say of science that it is the study of those phenomena so crude that the time in which they occur does not affect them. And so falling balls, you know, gas diffusion, simple things, it doesn't matter where in time they occur. But things like the building of an empire, the waging of a war, the evolution of a species, the conquest of a biome by a new set of genes, these things, timing is everything and dictates success or failure. Did you want to say something?
Yeah, that's a very interesting point, because the Greek anthropic cosmological principle argues that life evolved at about the right time. If things had started up a little bit later, a little bit sooner, at least around this sun, it wouldn't necessarily have gotten a kickstart. The conditions were no longer quite right. The incubator was set to just the right temperature when the gases were at just the right concentrations and so on. And Stephen Gould has pointed out that we couldn't even play the tape over again if you started off with life at one of the early conditions 3.5 billion years ago and then ran it forward again. We wouldn't have ended up with people, and we wouldn't have ended up with the kinds of species we have. There are too many bifurcation points that can take place along the line. So there's actually 2 points there.
Yes, well, this is essentially what this is saying. Ordinary science says that evolution proceeds by the random mixing of genes, then subject to natural selection dictated by environmental parameters. And out of that, you do get a creative advance, or an advance into morphological complexity, but very slowly. And I think that what the time wave shows is that the cosmic deck is stacked in favor of novelty, so that it isn't a 50-50 every time you throw the dice, that it's going to go toward entropy or order. Actually, order is favored, and so order emerges and is conserved over time, or novelty. I prefer the term novelty because to me chaos doesn't signify disorder. I view it in the new way. Well, anyway, maybe that's enough about that. I didn't intend such a long opening statement. It must be this coffee.
What you were saying sounds like, I think it was just recently, a couple months ago, the Hubble constant, the Hubble telescope was throwing things into question, and, I think, have you pursued that?
Yes, I follow all that very carefully. I touched on it in my lecture by implication last night. It was in my mind when I said how so much of science recently has been about answering the question, when? There is huge controversy raging at this moment in astrophysics because, here's the background. In the 1920s, Edwin Hubble studied variable stars, and in an effort to establish what are called absolute or reliable candles for measuring cosmic distance, knowing that if he could very accurately calibrate the radiance of this certain type of star, that then he could calculate how that radiance would diminish at distance. And there is a number involved with Hubble's name called the Hubble constant. And if you set it high, the universe is young. Did I get it right? And if you set it low, the universe is old. And furious battles are now raging because there is data coming in both from the Hubble telescope, ironically, named after Edwin Hubble. There is data coming in there that is supporting the idea, I believe, that using standard mathematics, the universe is young. In fact, paradoxically, younger than some of the oldest stars in it, which doesn't make a whole hell of a lot of sense. Conversely, from a different set of instruments, looking at a different part of the radio or electromagnetic universe, low Hubble constants values are coming in, implying that the universe is 18 to 22 billion years old rather than 6 to 8 or 8 to 10. And as far as the time wave is concerned, I was looking at this and I realized I should issue a press release and make a prediction and say that according to my calculations, the age of the universe is precisely X, and then see where these other people come down. I think the time wave favors the idea that the universe is about 17.5 billion years old. And that is in agreement with the data that does not contain an internal contradiction. I find the idea of a universe 8 billion years old almost as unlikely as a universe 4,306 years old. I feel real cramped in a 10 billion year old universe. That is not enough.
Well, I was just thinking that if the Hubble constant had a variation in time, that would probably describe it. Maybe your formulas might point to how it might vary in time. Or we have a locally varying Hubble constant.
Well, yes, you raise a whole bunch of interesting issues here. Look at how presumptuous science is. First of all of modern physics is based around the concept of constants. The central, and some of these are non-dimensional constants, but some are not, like the speed of light. Well, the speed of light has been measured on this planet since 1906. Less than 100, just under 100 years of measurement in a multi-billion-year-old universe carried out on one planet. And from this, you make the grand statement that the speed of light in all times and all places will obey this law of velocity. Give me a break. It's just a kind of a joke. And yet, to admit that there is a problem here would seriously undermine the premises of science. Things are worse than that. Throughout the 20th century, of course, the speed of light has been measured many, many times. Now, the same value is rarely obtained. Now, all of physics depends upon this being a universal constant. So when you point out to them that the same value is rarely obtained, they wave their hands and say, well, this has to do with the limits of the instrumentality, a term which will not be further defined. This has to do with the limits of the instrumentality, and they're just hitting around it, right? So at first you, the uneducated layman, you think, well, that makes sense. I suppose they're just hitting around it. But then you go back and you look at these measurements of the speed of light, and you know what? They don't cluster around a point. Since 1906, successive measurements of the speed of light seem to imply that it's incrementally going slightly faster. The set of data points is drifting slightly across the thing. Well, now, how, if it's at the limits of the instrumentality, can you possibly explain that? Well, this became such an issue in the astrophysics community, and check this out, that what they did is in 1972, they defined the speed of light. and they said, this is the speed of light. And all future calculations should use this number regardless of what the instruments are telling you. A momentous turning point in the evolution of scientific thought. At last, nature itself is deemed no longer necessary for the study of nature, and in fact it just gets in the way. Anyway, I can go on at great length about the foibles of science, but it's just fun to rib them. Yeah.
We're back to scholasticism, I guess. But by the same argument, couldn't you say how long is a year, especially when you're talking about births of universes in which Earths revolving around suns haven't yet evolved to measure the year, that we're now measuring the whole schmear in?
Well, you mean why... I'm not sure I understand you. Do you mean why do we place so much emphasis on the year count in the theory?
Well, how can way because...
Well, it doesn't really. What it depends on is a 384-day cycle, and which, if you were to press me, and I guess you are, as to why is it a 384-day cycle, well, it's 13 lunations, yes, but there's something mysterious going on there, and probably a good Newtonian could explain it to us. They do these studies, these geochronological studies using coral fossils, and they believe that the year length, that the year is slowly shrinking, and that about a billion years ago, the year length would have been about 384 days. And I suspect that the evolution of DNA, that there must have been, that the fact that the DNA runs on 64 and the I Ching runs on 64 and this number 384 keeps coming up in relationship to the lunation and the possible solar year length, I think that essentially the DNA must have frozen in itself a kind of picture of the various orbital and geomagnetic resonances that existed in the solar system or in the terrestrial environment at the time it came into existence. I mean, that's just my guess, but it would fit. Do you see what I mean? And then the fact that it's 13 lunations, the moon is despun, tidally despun. That's why we always see one face locked on the Earth, because it makes one revolution in the time that it makes one orbit. And that's the consequence of that. And it may be that, well, I'm not sure what I'm trying to say, but that there was a coupling of some sort between the Sun-Earth-Moon system a billion years ago that made a 384-day year possible.
But my point is, before that, when we're talking about the time between
I see what
the
you're
Big
asking.
Bang and planets, how long is a year?
Oh, well, my assumption is that the real formative cycles are quantum mechanical in dimension. In other words, we talk about a 384-day cycle, then we talk about a 6-day cycle, then an hour and 35-minute cycle, and then a minute and a half or something. But it's the cycles below, say, 10 to the minus 12 seconds. In other words, the whole universe, I assume, is some kind of amplification of quantum mechanical instability. And you and I have talked about how biology seems to be a chemical strategy for amplifying quantum mechanical indeterminacy so that it leaves the subatomic realm and can be present, in a 145-pound block of meat. I mean, that is what it is. The phenomenon of free will is quantum mechanically amplified determinacy in this complex chemical system that we call organic life. So the year thing isn't important. What's important is probably something down in the realm of Planck's constant, some slip in the cosmic machinery at a very basic level that was then exploded and amplified out into the phenomenal universe. I mean, the real question is why there is anything at all. Why this state was preferred over a state of pure nothingness, which would appear to be the bottom of the energy well. Yeah.
You've done a lot of thinking about morphological resonances of different sorts, and there's one that I've encountered that I really can't shake loose. I wonder if you have a comment on it. Reading about the brain, the estimates of the total number of neurons is about 100 billion. And as you read about cosmology, you read that the average spiral galaxy is thought to have 100 billion suns in it, and the total number of galaxies in the universe is estimated to be around 100 billion. And I recently encountered the estimate that the total number of biomolecules in a cell is about 100 billion. And it seems like this coincidence keeps coming up, and maybe it's related to Paul Dirac's idea of the large number.
Well, I think it is true that emergent properties come out of large aggregations. Always the textbook example is, if you have two H2O molecules, that's water, but you don't have wetness. Wetness doesn't emerge until you have thousands of H2O molecules. And so the wetness of water is a property which only emerges when you have millions of these molecules together. And it does appear that complex neural nets have to be above 9 billion operating subunits. And so, it may be that, definitely we are pushing toward criticality in any area of measurement. For example, if you look at the curve of energy release, or the population curve, or the curve of information production, or the curve of advancing velocity, you see that many of these curves will become asymptotic in the near future. And that's what I mean when I say we're headed into this domain of boundary dissolution and hyper-novel inflationary evolution, you could almost call it. Yeah.
Asymptotic.
Isn't that, asymptotic is when it's not doubling every time you measure it. It's being squared, isn't that it? Each time? Mm-hmm. So it goes logarithmic, asymptotic, and then there's another term for an even more rapid expansion. Yeah.
When I read futurist books on futurists, I've been to several things like that, they talk very similar to what you're saying, the radical changes that are coming, but they're looking at all the denominators of what they feel would cause this. And their sense of chaos is what you're talking about in a different way. Economic chaos, health chaos. Our Earth is headed for a tremendous upheaval in the cities, the concentration
right.
of so many people together in these megalithic centers of humanity, and are so disconnected with what man is, that they're saying the same thing that you're saying in a different way. They are saying the same thing.
Mm-hmm. Yes, well, as you see, they feel that they own the planet, and so they're very alarmed. Wouldn't you be if it were your property? And you say, my God, what is going on? We have to get hold of the neighborhood. But my faith is that the horse knows where it wants to go, and we're all being carried along for the ride. And, Mitsubishi, the Catholic Church, whoever wants to try and control it is welcome to try. But it's a perverse thing. We who think of ourselves as little people imagine that owning the earth must be a great pleasure. But actually, the number of ulcer tablets being consumed in the chancelleries, bourses, and embassies of this planet seems to argue that thinking you own the world is an enormous headache and aggravation. The chaos is roving through the system and able to undo at any point the best laid plans. All kinds of things are happening. First of all, there are all these fields of research ranging from cryogenics, nanotechnology, psychedelic pharmacology, disease control, machine-human interfacing. You could just list these things endlessly. And at any moment, one of these fields could make a breakthrough so fundamental that everything would be changed. And we have, 50 of these irons going in the fire all the time. At the same time, because the planetary culture is becoming ever more closely knitted together, all its parts are becoming codependent. So, for instance, an earthquake which destroys central Tokyo would ruin the economy of Belgium, because the retraction of Japanese capital from world markets would set up reverberations that would be felt everywhere. The system is being slaved ever more tightly to various portions of itself. Crop failure in Russia causes, strikes in Argentina and so forth and so on. And this will accelerate. Well, then the task of management somehow is to bring this coalescing system through this transition period without the whole thing getting so much vibration built up into it that it falls apart. And so it's very alarming to see barbarism uncontrolled in the world, to see, people being pushed into boxcars on their way to extermination camps and all this. This means that that the global control systems are in danger of breaking down. And I think that the world corporate state is running hard to keep up. National governments do not understand what is going on. National governments are underpaid, understaffed, and under-talented. World corporate divisions of various sorts do understand what is going on, but they are in the process of taking power from the national states as rapidly as possible in order to use that power to manage the planet in a somewhat less ideologically hysterical fashion. I mean, they want to make money, but that's a different thing than wanting to convert everybody to Islam, Marxism, or National Socialism, or something like that. I'm fascinated by management because it's the large-scale understanding and integration of human systems. And that's the real challenge. I mean, it's all very fine to take these mathematical models and write and describe the behavior of the dripping faucet, as was done very creatively. But the purpose of all this modeling is to eventually take control of our own relationships to each other and to the world and to the future and to the future generations.
It's somewhat paradoxical, though, because management would appear to be key, yet what we're talking about managing can't be managed.
No, but what can be managed is our anxiety about it. In other words, I think of it as though what we're in is an aircraft, a cultural airfoil moving through history. And the challenge is change your Sopwith Camel into an F-18 in flight, because we're going faster and faster and faster, and Q forces, vibration, are beginning to build up on all the airfoils. And so what we have to do is transform the cultural engine, or the forward acceleration into the temporal medium will burn the wings off and rip the airfoil apart.
What you're talking about is metamorphosis. Would you comment on examples of metamorphosis in nature to what's going on there?
Well, the perfect example is, of course, insect metamorphosis, which if you read my book, The True Hallucinations, and I think it's mentioned in The Invisible Landscape, there was a great deal of talk about insect metamorphosis at La Chorrera. I've never received a satisfactory answer to the question put to evolutionary biologists: how do you account for the metamorphosis of insects, where, like in the case of butterflies, hundreds, if not thousands, of genes have to be coordinated perfectly to take a caterpillar, dissolve all its body tissue, and have it completely reconstruct itself as another kind of organism. I'm trying to imagine an evolutionary scenario of gradual mutation that would give you that is, I can't do it. It must have happened largely instantaneously in a single massive rearrangement of hundreds and hundreds of genes. And we don't see that much in animal life. We see large-scale polyploidy in plants. So maybe this happened in animal tissue only once or twice in the life of the planet. But it gave this insect adaptation, which is astonishing, you know. And in a way, what we're doing is repeating that metamorphosis on a metaphorical as well as physical plane. I mean, we are rather like worms, and we have built a society that is somewhat, you know, might ungenerously be described as a carrion pile. But there is apparently in us the capacity to evolve to this other form. And there is, as long as we're roving through exotic biological metaphors here, there is a phenomenon in biology called neoteny. Neoteny is the preservation of juvenile characteristics into adulthood. And we, as a primate species, exhibit advanced forms of neoteny. This is why we are hairless to adulthood. This is why our skull-to-body ratio remains infantile compared to other primates throughout life. It's why we require such a long period of physical upbringing. Well, there are certain animals that will remain in the juvenile stage their entire lifetime unless certain environmental parameters shift. And what I mean by that is, say you have a kind of salamander. Well, it exists as a kind of a tadpole its entire life, and for generations it can do this, living as a tadpole. But if the pool dries up, the organisms in the pool at that time suddenly discover that they have the capacity to develop lungs and crawl out onto the land. And they do, even though perhaps this hasn't been done in that neighborhood for generations. And I think we are sort of in that position. We have a capacity inside ourselves that we have not yet unfolded, and we may not for a while. When things really get nutty, part of the getting nutty is that we will discover present in our human population all the time were mutants of certain types that had no evolutionary advantage as long as bourgeois society and Judeo-Christian ethics were in place. But when that begins to shake and shimmer, then these mutant types will emerge to the fore. This is how evolution works, by the way, in animal populations. The mutants are always present, but they have no consequence unless the environmental parameters shift and give them then a special advantage. And I think being able to see hyperspatially is the special adaptive advantage that psychedelic plants confer upon the people who use them. It is literally, you see the world with different eyes. And it's going to make it possible for you to find your way through the future in a way that will be very difficult for people who are looking at the situation through the eyes of materialism, Newtonianism, positivism, and so forth. Yeah.
That's the question, I guess, that keeps coming up to me was, what are we supposed to do?
Yeah, I keep thinking that too.
Well, I keep saying, de-emphasize anxiety. Reassure people. You meet people who say, you know, I'm really scared. I'm scared about my job. I'm scared about my relay. I'm scared, scared, scared. The answer is, you know, don't worry. You don't know enough to worry. That's God's truth. who do you think you are that you should worry, for crying out loud? I mean, it's a total waste of time. It presupposes such a knowledge of the situation that it is, in fact, a form of hubris. You know, no, what you do is just pay your bills and, you know, pack heat if you need to, and don't worry. That's all. Yes.
Someone just a few days ago told me, don't worry, don't take it so seriously because none of us are going to get out of it alive.
Well, no, that's a more dismal conclusion. Worry is praying to the devil. That's great. Worry is betting against yourself. You know, Wi Po Yang, a great Chinese Taoist who wrote many, many commentaries on the I Ching, he was asked at the end of his life what was his conclusion of a life of studying the I Ching. And he said, worry is preposterous. That was it. If we are serious about who we are and not ashamed of our dreams, then we have to build on the scale of solar systems. I mean, we have the imaginative power to be a galactarian civilization. It's just that we have a pissant control of energy at the moment. But if there's somebody out there who needs consulting, you know, somebody who does have hyperlight drive and time travel but just doesn't know what to do with it, ask us. We are very creative. And I've tracked this very closely in the literature. And up until about 5 years ago, time travel definitely, if you were writing about that, you were a squirrel. Nobody was talking about that. And since then, Scientific American has devoted an entire issue to it. Nick Herbert, who I do not consider a squirrel, wrote an excellent book about it. There have been articles in Physical Review, and it's gone from it's completely impossible, don't even think of it, to, well, certain thought experiments can be imagined which do seem to imply... Well, that's how relativity got started, you know, talking about trains passing each other at the speed of light and what would happen if. It's so hard to make people understand because we're in this new age environment of fishy thinking. But the entities inside the DMT trance are real entities. I mean, they're as real as you and I are. You would have trouble proving your own ontological validity if pressed by a skilled philosopher. So they're as real as we are. Well, this then has to be taken seriously. Questions like, where are they? Who are they? What do they know? Because they're intelligent. And we're intelligent, and we've been yapping about space people and all this malarkey. You know, they are here. If flying saucers landed on the south lawn of the White House tomorrow, it wouldn't be as weird as what happens to you when you smoke DMT. It would just be a news story, something for NASA to take over. Chomsky would explain it to us, the linguistic side, I mean. But you personally can meet the alien anytime you want, and the culture can meet the alien anytime they want. Well, are these things here for no reason? Are we just sort of there on their trip and we're on our trip? Or have they come for us? Is there a message? Is there a purpose? And why does this seem so drenched in super technologies and intimations of time travel? I mean, are these things dead souls? Are they a future state of humanity that's come back 100 million years to the dawn ages of intelligence to observe, you know, the discovery of starflight? Or what is happening? It needs to be looked at. And, you know, I got I went into this very deeply with shamanism, but shamanism is a set of culturally sanctioned explanations for people who didn't know how to ask the kinds of questions we ask. And so you can only go so far with that. And eventually you realize, Jung won't help you, or Mircea Eliade, or no. You have to make sense of this on your own terms. It's very unexpected that this would happen. I've always assumed I would be a aeronautical engineer or something like that. I never thought that the culture would turn 90 degrees and discover in, the biology of the planet an alien intelligence. I mean, that's what the 20th century will probably be remembered for, and very few of us can even articulate it to ourselves. In the way that the 15th century discovered the New World, the 20th century discovered the parallel continuum. It begins with Freud and noticing something about the fantasies of these Viennese housewives, and then Jung splicing in the myths, and then the surrealists and Iliad, and then the drug people come along, and Huxley, and so forth, until finally people say, as that wonderful line in Rosemary's Baby, "My God, this is really happening." Yes, what did you think? Over here.
I have a question. Lecture, from what I understand, and I'm not a mathematician, but they're using formulas based on double pyramids and tetrahedric.
Yeah. Well, I think, that these kinds of occult calculations, this is a legitimate way to proceed. This is how Kepler modeled the solar system, was by putting the Greek perfect mathematical forms inside each other. But I am really aware, from having worked 20 years on the time wave, how woolly it gets out there in the numbers as when you're looking for correlations, and there are a whole bunch of these things. There are the people in New Zealand with the world grid system. There's the whole Jose Arguelles cosmology. There's Ouspensky was an early one, In Search of the Miraculous. Yeats' book of Vision is a complex mathematical thing explaining the cosmos. And there seems to be something in us that we are systematizers. We produce systems, and these are integrated systems of means. And the only thing you can do is lay them before your fellow monkeys and see what goes on. And I usually am a reluctant participant. I'm not much fun when it comes to weird ideas because I just pour cold water on them. For instance, right now my mail is running pretty heavily toward people who want to inform me about and convert me to the works of Zecharia Sitchin, and this is do you know who I'm talking about? Well, this is a complex cosmology. It involves 5 or 6 books. It involves a lost planet which comes into the inner solar system every 35,000 years or so, which was responsible for Jesus and it's a whole thing. And people who I up to that point had considered sane found it very interesting, and I was it was so I think the only thing you can I am in this same position. I mean, someone could certainly react phobically to my thing. So I think what you have to say about these ideas is they just have to be dropped out of the nest, and you see what can fly and what can't. However, then here's a piece of advice which you may not need or want to hear. But this has worked for me, and it's not an orthodox piece of advice. But if you hear a claim that fascinates you or interests you, like a claim, well, just as an example, the face on Mars or the time wave or Zecharia Sitchin's thing, yes, you should read the person's book and you should think about it on that level. But what you should also do is try to find out as much about this person as possible. It's very hard for people to hide their pasts. And if it turns out that your particular revelator did some time in Tennessee for auto theft, or was last seen fleeing Germany with a valise of cash, then you know. And this was very effective for me with the crop circles. An investigation of the histories of the major personalities was a journey into, well, I can't even find words to describe it, but that's the thing to look at. Look at the people. Look at their lives, their credit histories, their bank accounts, and then judge their cosmogonic visions. Some people would probably say that's unfair, but in a sense it goes back to what I said a couple of days ago about aesthetics. You know, the revelation of the mystery, one thing is for sure, it will not be tacky. It won't be tasteless. You know, it won't be wearing sequins, for God's sake. It won't pass out 10% discount coupons. Sorry.
Will it charge at all?
Will it charge at all? Where I pulled out is I was at one of these expos, you know, that are around, and I toured the thing. And if you ever go to one of those things, they are horrendous. I mean, Moldavite suppositories and just the damnedest stuff. And I was making my way through the booths, the various therapies, channelings, and revelations, and this young woman in a short skirt rushed out and took me by the elbow, and she said, "Excuse me, sir, could I interest you in elective cosmetic surgery?" And I said, "No." And she said, "Well, how about the drawing for the Camaro?" I said, No. But that's all right. The marketplace has always been a noisy place.